The scene materializes not merely as a recollection, but as an almost dreamlike tableau, so vivid it could have been meticulously crafted for the silver screen, yet it remains an indelible moment from lived history. Picture the late 1920s, deep within colonial Kenya, a land baking under a relentless, often merciless, equatorial sun. As twilight finally yielded to night, offering a fragile coolness, a gathering of British expatriates could be found, their silhouettes moving freely upon a manicured lawn. They were dancing, shoes cast aside, a small act of rebellion against the stiff formalities of their homeland, their bare feet pressing into the cool, dew-kissed grass. The music, perhaps from a wind-up gramophone or a small spirited band, drifted with a languid grace on the warm, perfumed night air, a soundtrack to their carefully constructed paradise. Above them, paper lanterns, like captured fireflies, swayed gently in the subtle breeze, their soft light casting an ephemeral glow on the dancers and the lush, exotic foliage that bordered the garden. And just beyond this cultivated haven, the untamed African wilderness encroached, a place where the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth or the distant, haunting cry of a night bird served as a constant, thrilling reminder of the wildness that lay so near. At the very heart of this intoxicating spectacle stood a woman of undeniable presence, Lady Idina Sackville. She was a striking figure, draped in a loose, elegant gown that flowed with her movements, a cigarette smouldering delicately in one hand, a bubbling glass of champagne glinting in the other. Her laughter, rich and unrestrained, echoed through the night, the sound of a woman entirely comfortable with being the center of attention, a woman who commanded notice. Yet what most attendees at that glittering party, caught up in the heady mix of music, champagne, and illicit glances, likely failed to perceive was the profound, secret sorrow that lay carefully concealed beneath that polished, effortlessly carefree exterior. It was a heartache interwoven with brewing scandal, elements that would not only shadow her, but ultimately come to define the very essence of Lady Idina Sackville's tumultuous and widely chronicled existence. For a great many, both then and now, Idina Sackville's name alone is enough to conjure a whirlwind of images, of lavish, champagne-fueled parties that stretched into the dawn, of a string of marriages that kept society tongues wagging, and of whispered gossip that travelled like wildfire from the hushed, opulent drawing rooms of Britain's high society to the most remote and sun-drenched outposts of what was then the sprawling British Empire. She was a pivotal, luminous figure within the notorious Happy Valley set, a hedonistic social circle thriving in Kenya, a group that not only embraced but revelled in excess and a flagrant disregard for conventional morality. But what remains far less understood, often obscured by the glare of scandal, is the immense emotional toll such an unrestrained life exacted from her. The personal tragedies and profound upheavals that scarred her early years did more than just leave their mark. They effectively set the stage, laying a tragic foundation for the breathtakingly reckless abandon she would so often and so publicly display. To truly comprehend the intricate tapestry of her story and to appreciate why it continues to resonate with a certain compelling power, one must journey back in time to an era when the world itself seemed to tremble on the very precipice of sweeping, unimaginable change, the dawn of the 20th century. Idina Sackville entered this world in 1893. Born into the aristocratic embrace of the Sackville family, a lineage that boasted centuries of accumulated prestige, considerable wealth, and more than its fair share of inherent drama and intrigue. At this historical juncture, Great Britain stood proudly at the zenith of its imperial power, its dominion extending like vast tentacles across the globe, controlling territories and shaping the destinies of millions. Back in England, Edwardian society, with its rigid hierarchies and elaborate codes of conduct, prized above all else a strict adherence to etiquette and deeply entrenched traditions. However, beneath this seemingly unshakable facade of order, the younger generation was already beginning to stir restlessly, chafing under the weight of such suffocating strictures, tentatively at first, then more boldly testing the very limits of established social norms. Idina's parents moved within the most exclusive and influential circles, and thus, from her earliest consciousness, she was immersed in a world of grand, imposing country houses, elaborate, multi-course dinners, and the endless, ritualized social engagements that defined upper-class existence. Yet, hidden behind this meticulously maintained facade of refined luxury and effortless grace, lay a complex and often fraught web of family dynamics, a situation made all the more volatile by unforeseen tragedies that would strike with an unpredictable, devastating force, casting long shadows over her formative years. Those who knew her intimately, who witnessed her vulnerabilities behind closed doors, would later suggest with conviction that her sometimes erratic and bewildering adult behavior was not a mere whim or affectation, but was instead deeply and inextricably rooted in the profound emotional upheavals and instabilities of her youth. Even as a child, Idina was described as possessing an unusually keen and watchful eye, a perceptive gaze that missed little. She was acutely aware of the unspoken undercurrents of tension that so often rippled beneath the polite veneer of adult interactions, and she intuited the unwritten, paradoxical rules of aristocratic life, rules that seemed, with a cruel irony, to simultaneously grant almost infinite privilege while inflicting the most crippling and unseen restraints. Like most young women of her privileged social standing, her formal education was entrusted to a series of governesses. She received instruction in French, the language of diplomacy and high culture, in music, an essential social grace, and in the myriad subtle arts of comportment and conversation designed to prepare her for what was considered the ultimate goal, a suitable and advantageous marriage. But unlike many of her sheltered contemporaries who seemed content to follow the prescribed path, Idina developed a fiercely independent streak, a rebellious spirit that chafed against expectation. This inherent defiance was evident even in seemingly small acts of childhood willfulness. Her resolute refusal to wear a particular dress she deemed too dull or unfashionable, or her penchant for audaciously sneaking away during formal social events to seek the more robust and engaging company of grooms and horses in the stables. Decades later, as memories were sifted and shared, people who had known her as a spirited young girl would often recall that she seemed to have been born free, an observation uttered with a mixture of awe, bewilderment, and, at times, a distinct note of disapproval. By the early 1910s, the very atmosphere of the world seemed to be thrumming with a palpable anticipation, a sense that something immense, something transformative, was about to occur, though few could have predicted the exact, horrifying shape it would ultimately take. The old, gilded Edwardian era, with its certainties and its rigid social order, was visibly waning, its light dimming, and on the horizon, the dark clouds of a war, unlike any the world had ever witnessed, were gathering with ominous speed. Society stood teetering on the brink of a cataclysmic and irreversible transformation, and it was into this volatile atmosphere that Idina found herself on the cusp of adulthood, her own life about to intersect with the grand, chaotic sweep of history. In 1913, at the tender age of just 20, an age of romantic ideals and hopeful aspirations, she married her first husband, a wealthy and eligible young man named Ewan Wallace. The wedding, as befitted their social station, was precisely the sort of grand, high society affair that filled the illustrated pages of British newspapers. A dazzling spectacle of aristocratic union. Surviving photographs from that day show Idina, resplendent in an elegant, fashionable gown, radiating that spirited, almost defiant confidence that would become her unmistakable hallmark throughout her life. Friends and confidants from that period recounted that she viewed marriage not merely as a social contract, but as a profound promise of grand, sweeping romance, and perhaps more urgently, as an escape from some of the more stifling and restrictive aspects of her aristocratic upbringing. But the dream was to be short-lived. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 shattered the gilded, fragile certainties of her social sphere, and indeed of the entire world, ushering in an era of unprecedented brutality and loss. Ewan, like so many men of his generation and class, served in the war, leaving Idina, now a young mother to two small boys, to navigate the complexities of supporting his efforts from afar, while managing a household increasingly shaped by the anxieties and unpredictabilities of a global conflict. The days were often long and filled with a gnawing loneliness, a stark contrast to the vibrant social life she had known. The immense pressures of the war, the constant fear, and the prolonged separations inevitably strained their relationship, chipping away at its foundations. Society itself, reeling from the staggering and unprecedented loss of life on the battlefields, began to profoundly question its long-held values and traditions, a collective disillusionment setting in. Many marriages, once thought unshakable, foundered under the immense weight of shared grief, enforced separation, and the bitter taste of widespread disillusionment that permeated the post-war air. And Idina's was no exception to this societal fracturing. She and Ewan divorced in 1919. In an era when divorce was still a relatively rare and deeply scandalous undertaking, especially for someone of her elevated social class. The decision sent palpable ripples of shock and disapproval through the rarefied circles of the aristocracy. Yet Idina, even then, seemed to possess an innate ability to shrug off societal judgment, to press forward with a resolute determination, asserting what she passionately saw as her fundamental right to find happiness, on her own terms, regardless of the cost. This, however, was only the dramatic overture to her astonishingly turbulent marital roller coaster. She would marry again, and then again and again, eventually walking down the aisle a remarkable total of 5 times. This sheer number of matrimonial ventures alone would have been sufficient to guarantee her a considerable degree of notoriety in the society of her day. But her name became almost inextricably, legendarily synonymous with scandal, thanks in large part to the decadent, hedonistic social scene she not only joined but actively cultivated and came to dominate in Kenya, an expatriate enclave of wealthy, thrill-seeking Britons that gained infamy as the Happy Valley set. In the deeply scarred and cynical wake of the Great War, many British aristocrats found themselves profoundly disenchanted with the old, staid norms and restrictive conventions of life in England. They sought refuge, adventure, and a more uninhibited existence overseas, particularly in those far-flung parts of the empire where life seemed to promise more freedom, fewer rules, and a distinct lack of judgmental eyes. Kenya, with its breathtakingly vast landscapes, its exotic allure, and its abundant opportunities for hedonistic pursuits, from big game hunting to all-night parties, attracted a very particular subset of these thrill-seekers and social renegades. And Idina, with her restless spirit and disdain for convention, fits seamlessly into this milieu. When she first arrived in Kenya in the early 1920s, full of vivacity and eager for new experiences, she was married to the undeniably charismatic and dashing Jocelyn Hay, the man who would later inherit the title of the 22nd Earl of Errol. Together, Idina and Joss Hay, as he was known, plunged headfirst into a lifestyle defined by unapologetic indulgence, a dizzying whirl of parties, and a complex web of romantic, often illicit, entanglements. Sensational tales began to circulate, whispered in colonial clubs and relayed in hushed tones back in England. Stories of alcohol-fueled gatherings that raged with a feverish intensity until the first light of dawn broke over the African plains. Of unspoken, almost codified agreements among the core members of their group that extramarital affairs were not just tolerated, but were considered almost par for the course, a natural extension of their liberated philosophy, and of elaborate hunts and adventurous safaris that often served as convenient and exciting pretexts for all manner of secret rendezvous and passionate trysts. In the diaries and letters penned by those who visited or were part of this extraordinary scene, Idina was consistently described not merely as a participant, but as the undisputed ringleader, the captivating high priestess of that outrageous and boundary-defying social experiment. One particularly illustrative, though lesser-known event, rarely discussed openly at the time due to its inherently scandalous nature, reportedly happened around 1924. Idina, in her characteristic grand style, hosted an exceptionally extravagant party to celebrate the triumphant end of a particularly successful and arduous safari. For this grand occasion, she extended invitations not just to the usual cohort of British aristocrats and Happy Valley regulars, but also, in a somewhat audacious move, to a number of local dignitaries, influential settlers, and prosperous farmers, clearly hoping to impress upon them all her unique and rather shocking style of hospitality. As the evening progressed and the champagne flowed ever more freely, she reportedly encouraged, even orchestrated, everyone present to swap partners for a dance, a suggestion that rapidly turned the already lively gathering into something of a steamy, overtly suggestive spectacle, pushing the boundaries of even their relaxed moral code. According to an eyewitness account, scribbled hastily in a private letter that was only much later discovered tucked away in an attic, at least one conservative guest took profound offense at the display, storming off into the night and loudly proclaiming that Idina was undeniably doomed to a future of profound heartbreak if she continued so recklessly on her current path of excess and moral abandon. That prescient letter strongly suggests that beneath the veneer of constant jokes, uproarious laughter, and performative nonchalance, some observers recognized a deeply troubling, painful streak of self-destruction woven into the fabric of her behavior. And indeed, heartbreak, in various forms, was always lurking close at hand, a constant shadow in her sun-drenched Kenyan paradise. Despite the outward projection of almost blinding glamour and unshakable confidence, Idina carried deep, unhealed wounds within her. Perhaps the most profound and persistently painful of these was the devastating loss of custody over her two young sons from her first marriage to Ewan Wallace. When she and Ewan divorced, the British courts of the era, still heavily and anachronistically biased toward fathers, especially when mothers were deemed in any way morally questionable or unconventional, awarded Ewan the sole right to raise their boys. For Idina, this was a crushing, soul-destroying blow. In the years that followed, she fought with a desperate, often heartbreaking tenacity, though ultimately without success, to reclaim some significant portion of their upbringing to be more than just a distant, fleeting presence in their lives. This profound and enforced estrangement from her children haunted her relentlessly, a persistent ache in her soul, and some who knew her well have suggested that it was this deep, unassuaged grief that drove her, at least in part, to the frenetic, almost manic lifestyle that came to define her public image, a desperate attempt to outrun her sorrow. Yet, if Idina's emotional scars were at times seemingly self-inflicted, a consequence of her own choices and provocations, they were also undeniably rooted in a much broader and more significant cultural shift that was reshaping Western society. The 1920s, often dubbed the Roaring Twenties, witnessed an unprecedented explosion of permissiveness and a casting off of old restraints in certain influential social circles. This was, in many ways, a direct and visceral backlash against the unimaginable horrors and senseless slaughter of World War I. A potent, live-for-today attitude, a desperate seizing of the moment, overtook many who had witnessed the fragility of life and within the insulated, indulgent confines of the Happy Valley set, that hedonistic mentality reached its most flamboyant and often shocking extremes. Idina's undeniably magnetic presence, her charm, and her utter refusal to be cowed by convention made her an instant icon of that permissive, convention-defying generation. People who encountered her often described her as mesmerizing, someone who could flash a dazzling, conspiratorial smile and, in an instant, make you feel as if you were the most fascinating, witty, and important person in the entire room. And yet, behind the carefully constructed facade, in the quiet solitude of her private moments, she wrote desperate, heart-wrenching letters to her closest friends, letters that revealed an ongoing, debilitating battle with depression and a profound, almost childlike yearning for genuine emotional security and lasting, unconditional love. Her relationships with her various husbands paint a remarkably complicated and often contradictory portrait of a woman searching for something she could perhaps never truly find. With Jocelyn Hay, her partner in the early Kenyan adventures, their connections seem to be a tempestuous, volatile mix of electrifying passion and bitter, destructive conflict. Rumors swirled constantly, alleging intense jealousy, dramatic betrayals, and a fiery dynamic on both sides that ultimately proved unsustainable. Then came Donald Haldeman, a seemingly more stable figure who earnestly tried to tame her famously restless spirit, encouraging her to leave the wild excesses of Kenya behind and settle into a quieter, more conventional life. But that marriage, too, ultimately failed. Some whispered it was because Idina was by then too deeply enmeshed in, perhaps even addicted to, the constant excitement of partying, flirtation, and the attention it brought. Others murmured that Haldeman himself eventually grew tired and resentful of constantly competing with the long shadow of her scandalous past and the ghosts of her former lovers. She would go on to marry a few more times, each new union embarked upon with a seemingly unquenchable optimism, always searching with a kind of desperate hope for that elusive, perfect partnership that might finally bring her lasting joy and a sense of inner peace. And each time she embarked on a new marriage, her close friends, those who had witnessed her cycles of hope and despair, would quietly and anxiously wonder amongst themselves whether this man, this new partner, would finally be the one to help her find that desperately sought-after serenity, a safe harbor from her own inner tempests. As word of the Happy Valley set's increasingly outrageous scandals and moral laxity trickled back to England, often embellished and sensationalized, the British tabloids, ever hungry for aristocratic misbehavior, feasted voraciously on the stories. They gleefully and cruelly dubbed Idina the Bolter, a catchy, dismissive nickname that implied she was a flighty woman who ran off from her commitments and responsibilities at the slightest provocation or whim. And in a certain superficial truth, she did indeed come to represent a new type of rebellious, modern woman. One who utterly refused to remain trapped in an unhappy or unfulfilling marriage out of mere social obligation or fear of societal censure. Yet, the salacious press coverage rarely, if ever, captured the deeper, more complex layers of her story. The profound, enduring heartbreak of a motherhood so cruelly cut short. The intangible, often hidden sorrow that lay beneath her famously bright, infectious laughter. And the pervasive, underlying sense that she lived each day with a feverish intensity, as though it might genuinely be her last. This urgency was fueled in part by a deep-seated fear of the crushing emptiness and silence that she knew would inevitably descend when the music finally stopped and the party was over. In the more personal, intimate anecdotes shared by those who knew her well, away from the glare of public scrutiny, a telling and rather surprising consistency emerges. Beneath the scandalous reputation, Idina could be, and often was, unbelievably kind and possessed of a quiet generosity. One close friend recalled a specific incident when a local Kenyan family, people of modest means, tragically lost their simple home and all their possessions to a devastating fire. While many others in their privileged expatriate circle busied themselves with shallow gossip about the event or offered only token gestures of sympathy, Idina, without any fanfare or desire for recognition, quietly and substantially funded the complete rebuilding of the family's hut. She also took care of their immediate pressing needs, even going so far as to arrange for new clothes, essential supplies, and replacement livestock to help them get back on their feet. She never boasted about such acts of kindness. Indeed, she rarely spoke of them at all. In fact, in that particular instance, she specifically asked the grateful family not to mention her name or her involvement to anyone. This compassionate, unassuming side of her character didn't align neatly or at all with the lurid, sensationalized headlines that so often painted her as a heartless, self-absorbed libertine. It strongly suggests that she possessed a deep, innate nurturing impulse, a maternal instinct that, perhaps, when denied an outlet towards her own children, she often redirected outward towards others in need, in quiet, unpublicized ways. Naturally, her flamboyant, convention-defying lifestyle drew widespread and often vehement controversy. Some of her contemporaries found her exhilarating, a vibrant and courageous symbol of liberation from the stifling, hypocritical constraints of outdated Edwardian norms. They admired her audacity and her apparent freedom. Others, however, condemned her unequivocally for so openly flouting what they considered to be fundamental moral standards, particularly those concerning the sanctity of marriage and the sacred duties of motherhood. Historians, even today, continue to debate the complex question of the extent to which she was primarily a victim of her era's particularly punishing and unforgiving social codes for women versus the degree to which she was an active, willing agent in her own numerous scandals and misfortunes. Some scholars argue persuasively that she epitomized the roaring, rebellious side of the 1920s, a representative figure of a generation deeply traumatized by war and fiercely determined to reject the old, discredited ways of their parents. Others, with equal conviction, see her more as an extreme outlier, an aristocrat blessed or cursed with too much inherited money, too much leisure time, and far too little sense of responsibility or societal obligation, her excesses fueled and amplified by the exotic, permissive settings she inhabited and the seemingly infinite indulgences available to her. Idina's intense and storied connection to Jocelyn Hay also tragically became intertwined with a much bigger, darker historical drama when he was found brutally murdered in Kenya in 1941. This sensational crime, which remains officially unsolved, has been endlessly explored in numerous books and films about the Happy Valley set, becoming one of the defining, iconic mysteries of that era. Though Idina and Hay had long since parted ways by the time of his death, the shocking murder and the subsequent highly sensationalized trial of Sir Jock Delves Broughton cast a long, ominous shadow over everyone who had ever been associated with that glamorous, tight-knit and morally ambiguous group. People inevitably speculated in hushed tones and avidly read newspaper columns about whether Idina, with her intimate knowledge of the set's inner workings and secrets, could somehow have been involved, or at the very least, whether she was privy to confidential information or hidden truths that might have clarified the shocking and brutal event. While there has never been any credible evidence to suggest she played any direct role in Hay's murder, the tragedy undeniably deepened the pervasive, almost gothic sense of a curse or a dark fate that seemed to cling tenaciously to the Happy Valley circle. It was yet another stark, brutal moment when the carefully constructed illusions of carefree, endless pleasure were violently shattered under the undeniable weight of real, irreversible violence and its devastating consequences. Her own life, though, after the most dramatic and scandal-ridden phase of her Happy Valley existence had passed, continued along quieter, more subdued arcs, though never entirely free from the echoes of her past. Eventually, as the winds of change blew and the Happy Valley scene began to lose its luster, she moved back to Europe. There, she attempted, with varying degrees of success, to reinvent herself, to cultivate a more subdued and conventional persona, far from the wild Kenyan nights. By the 1930s and 1940s, the world found itself facing another, even more cataclysmic global war, and once again, everything changed utterly. For Idina, this period meant drifting somewhat aimlessly through various social environments and geographical locations. She was sometimes living in London, trying to reconnect with old acquaintances. Sometimes residing quietly in the English countryside, seeking a semblance of peace. And at other times, traveling, perhaps searching for something she couldn't quite name. The grand, extravagant parties grew far less frequent, and she no longer garnered the same kind of feverish, breathless press attention that had once followed her every move. Still, even in her later years, she managed to maintain a certain undeniable aura of mystery and faded glamour. People would recount how she'd occasionally appear at an event, perhaps a race meeting or a charity ball, always impeccably dressed in a glamorous hat and a luxurious fur coat, stepping elegantly out of a car, only to then vanish without explanation just as quickly and silently as she had arrived. leaving behind only a lingering cloud of expensive perfume and a flurry of renewed speculation about her enigmatic life. One particularly poignant and rarely told anecdote from her later, more reflective years involves a quiet, tentative reunion with one of her estranged sons. By then, he was a grown man with a family and a life of his own, having spent the vast majority of his existence separated from and largely without his mother. After much hesitation, he reportedly agreed to meet her in a discreet, unassuming hotel restaurant in London. A waiter, who happened to be working nearby that particular evening and who later recounted the story, said he observed a tall, distinguished, handsome young man walk into the dining room, his demeanor hesitant as he anxiously scanned the tables before his eyes finally settled on an elegantly dressed, poised older woman. They embraced, the waiter noted, with a distinct formality, their gestures more akin to those of polite acquaintances rather than a mother and son reuniting after years of painful separation. No one, of course, knows exactly what words were exchanged during that quiet, emotionally charged meal, or how they each truly felt in its aftermath. But the observant waiter remembered vividly that when they eventually parted ways, the man looked as if he was struggling to hold back a torrent of unshed tears. Idina, for her part, remained remarkably composed, maintaining her regal bearing until he had left the restaurant. Only then, the waiter recalled, did she lean back and whisper softly to herself, or perhaps to the empty chair opposite her, something profoundly melancholic about how time, once lost, can never truly be reversed or reclaimed. If this poignant story is true, and there seems no compelling reason to doubt the waiter's detailed recollection, it points unmistakably to the haunting, persistent regret that likely lingered in the shadows of her final years. She was married for the fifth and ultimately last time to a man named William Vincent Soltow, and with him she lived out a life that was, by all accounts, far removed from the swirling, intoxicating drama and scandalous notoriety of Kenya's heyday. Nevertheless, despite her attempts at a quieter existence, she never fully managed to shake the deeply ingrained public label of the adventurous, fiercely independent, and scandal-prone aristocrat who had so audaciously defied the conventional morality of her time. She passed away in 1955 at the age of 62, leaving behind a legacy so thoroughly steeped in rumor, conjecture, and tantalizing intrigue that it was, and often still is, incredibly difficult to separate the established facts from the embellishing fictions. The gossip columns of the day, ever eager for a dramatic narrative, widely reported that she died penniless, a destitute figure forgotten by the world. This was demonstrably untrue, though it is highly probable that her once considerable fortune had significantly dwindled over the decades of lavish living and multiple divorce settlements. Others claimed, with equal melodrama, that she was utterly alone and unloved at the end, another exaggeration that overlooked the complexities of her life. She did, in fact, have friends who genuinely cared for her, individuals who remembered not just the scandals, but also her generous spirit, her quick wit, and her underlying vulnerability. But it is undeniably fair to say that she spent her last years in a far more subdued and reflective fashion, a change that mirrored not only the natural processes of aging, but also the definitive end of a glamorous, reckless, and unrepeatable era. In ongoing historical debates and scholarly analyses, academics and biographers continue to ask complex questions. Was Idina Sackville, in her own unconventional way, a feminist pioneer boldly challenging the restrictive roles assigned to women? Or was she, more simply, just a captivating symbol of reckless, self-destructive indulgence, a product of her privileged yet troubled upbringing? Did she, through her defiance, blaze a trail, however controversially, for other women who sought to define marriage, sexuality, and motherhood on their own autonomous terms? Or was she, perhaps, simply a deeply troubled and emotionally scarred individual, flailing dramatically against societal constraints that in some fundamental ways existed to try and keep families and social structures stable, however imperfectly? The nuanced truth, as is so often the case with such complex lives, likely resides somewhere complexly in the middle of these contrasting interpretations. She did, undeniably, fight with a mother's fierce determination for the custody of her children, directly questioning and challenging the prevailing legal assumptions about automatic paternal ownership and a mother's supposed secondary rights. But she also, just as undeniably, openly and frequently engaged in behaviors that many, including some who loved her, found to be profoundly self-destructive and ultimately damaging. And she unquestionably left behind a significant wake of emotional damage and unresolved pain, particularly for her sons, who were forced to spend much of their formative childhood years estranged from her, living with the consequences of her choices. What cannot be ignored in any honest assessment of her life is the immense emotional toll of her choices. A toll exacted not just upon herself, but also, significantly, upon those who were closest to her, those who loved her, and those she left behind. The older one gets, the more one tends to understand, with a clarity born of experience, that each hard-won freedom, each act of rebellion, inevitably has its price, and that each defiance, however justified or thrilling, often leaves behind indelible scars, both visible and unseen. Idina's extraordinary story serves as a potent and enduring reminder that behind the glitzy, often scandalous headlines of bygone eras lived real, flesh-and-blood people, people who laughed with genuine joy, cried tears of real sorrow, loved with fierce passion, and worried, just as we do, about how they would ultimately be remembered by the world. Yes, she was undeniably a core member of a notoriously scandalous and self-indulgent clique, a figure who reveled in breaking taboos. But she was also, simultaneously, a mother who deeply mourned the loss of her children, a loyal and generous friend to those she held dear, and, in her own unique and often contradictory way, a resilient survivor of the extraordinarily tumultuous and rapidly changing times into which she was born. If one endeavors to look beyond the more salacious, attention-grabbing details that so often dominate her narrative, one finds a profoundly cautionary tale, a story about the seductive but ultimately hollow illusions of perpetual pleasure, about the profound, often unbearable loneliness that can accompany the forging of one's own independent path, especially when that path means constantly leaving others behind, and about the deep, unquenchable ache that comes with losing the very people one loves the most. For older audiences in particular, who have navigated their own share of life's complexities, Idina's life can bring up powerful, resonant reflections on the inexorable passage of time and the choices one makes along the way. Many of us have known our own moments of youthful rebellion, those heady times when we thought, with the certainty of youth, that we had finally found the elusive secret to true happiness, perhaps within some thrilling new social scene or a passionate but ill-fated romance, only to discover, with the wisdom of hindsight, that genuine, lasting fulfillment is often far more elusive and quietly found. Her story powerfully underscores just how absolutely crucial it is to hold on tightly to genuine, meaningful connections, especially with children and other loved ones, even and perhaps most importantly, when powerful social forces or compelling personal impulses threaten to pull us apart. The almost unbearable heartbreak of her losing her sons, the quiet, lingering sorrow of that possible, poignant reunion so late in her life. These are not just details in a biography. These are moments that resonate in a deeply universal and human way. They remind us with a stark clarity that no amount of superficial glamour, no degree of thrilling adventure or societal defiance can ever completely make up for or heal the profound and lasting pain of severed or damaged family ties. Looking back on her extraordinary story from the complex vantage point of our modern world, we might also see clear and troubling reflections of how generational trauma often plays out, its echoes reverberating through subsequent lives and relationships. The devastating aftermath of World War I, with its unprecedented scale of death and destruction, sent shockwaves through families, communities, and entire societies in ways that we are, even now, still coming to fully understand. Many members of that so-called lost generation, scarred and disillusioned, coped with their trauma by throwing themselves headlong into extreme forms of hedonism, or by embracing radical new ideologies, desperately seeking meaning or oblivion. Idina's chosen path was undeniably the hedonistic one, a relentless pursuit of pleasure and distraction. But even within that frantic pursuit, it seems clear she was also searching, perhaps unknowingly, for a sense of security, for unconditional love, and for a place where she truly belonged. That inherent poignant tension between her almost desperate desire for reckless, untrammeled freedom and a deep, often unacknowledged longing for rootedness, for stability, and for genuine connection is what gives her story its enduring, compelling emotional resonance. In reflecting on the multifaceted narrative of her life, we can discern the clear cautionary notes about the dangers of excess and the hollowness of superficiality. We can feel a deep empathy for a mother forcibly separated from her children, and we can still feel a certain fascination for someone who embraced the often chaotic and contradictory spirit of her age more boldly, more completely, and with more flamboyant defiance than most. She continues to echo, a ghostly but vibrant presence, through popular culture, occasionally surfacing in literary references to the wilder, more decadent side of the British aristocracy, or in ongoing academic debates about the evolution of gender roles and female agency in the early 20th century. But in the end, stripped of the layers of scandal and speculation, she was, quite simply, a woman. A woman with soaring hopes, profound flaws, consuming passions, and deep human regrets. In the final analysis, that fundamental humanity is precisely why her story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, still matters, still captivates, and still teaches us something about the enduring complexities of the human heart. It's a profoundly human story, set against the dramatic fading glories of a declining empire and the bright, often blinding lights of perpetual, extravagant parties. A life soaked in champagne, punctuated by tears, and fueled by a stubborn, almost indomitable hope. Whether we find ourselves admiring her courage and her spirit, or judging her choices and their consequences, we cannot deny that Lady Idina Sackville lived her life, for better or worse, unequivocally on her own terms, flawed, fearless, and ultimately unforgettable. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.